How are you doing? Uh-oh. Did we lose sound? Oh,
Oh,
okay. Okay. I hear
that's
you
good.
again. Yep,
Okay.
yep. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
That's good.
So tell me a little bit about yourself.
So I am Pentecostal, which I think I
Oh.
mentioned in the email. So I'm here to fight. No. Sorry.
Come on, you're not here to fight. We're here to.
No, we don't know how to talk Pentecostals, right? We just it's we just resort to physicality. No, so I'm Canadian. My name's Thomas. I've been in Canada my whole life, and I suppose what prompted me to reach out to you in the first place was I've been following your videos and sort of tracking along with Peterson since his start. And sort of, I remember seeing your first video relatively close to when it came out and kind of matching the two and finding a marriage between the two. And being in Canada, Peterson was obviously very salient because it's in the news when a Canadian professor is
strikes it big.
That's right. Yeah.
I've got a cold, so I'll be hacking and eating cough drops through. So go ahead.
That's fine, as long as I can drink the coffee. So then we're good.
Drink away.
Yeah, it's actually funny thought or note. You shared a video a little while ago of Peterson on Stephen Paikin, where he was originally talking with a lady from, it was a debate, like, is there a God? He had a beard. It's a very, very old clip of him. And he was talking with the lady from the United Church.
Yeah.
So it was funny, when you shared that video, I had a memory jog that was the first time I'd ever seen Peterson live. Me and my dad watched that. And I remember my dad's comment being something to the effect of, that guy's thinking on a different plane. Just sort of like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be debating him.
Interesting.
It's very funny to think back to that, because I was so young. That must have been many, many years ago now. So that was my first actual interaction with Peterson, was Stephen Paikin. So thank you, Paikin.
Wow. He was on that show a lot.
He was, yeah.
There's a lot of videos of him on that show.
Yeah, so which is so funny that the Lindsay Shepherd thing was played with him as a guest, considering how many times he'd been on the show. So it's very
yeah. It really is hilarious. You're playing Ontario Public Television. Oh, can't do that.
Yeah, and someone who's been on for 15 years, like
yeah,
as a repetitive guest, liked by the host. Like, it's just anyways.
It's insane.
No, what's wrong with consistency, right? Why would you want to have that? But I discovered Peterson almost at like a perfect point in life. It was like a combination between long commutes, easy to do work, and time to listen. So it was sort of a good time to be discovering him early on, when there was lots of interviews and he was on lots of YouTube shows and very accessible. The content was kind of coming out rapidly, right? Even more rapidly than now, which is sort of hard to believe. And I think what was so interesting to him, or for me anyways, was that as a Pentecostal, there isn't a lot of, here's a good way to explain it. Growing up, and I never knew that I wasn't, or that I was an Armenian. I just knew that I wasn't Calvinist, right? And it's sort of, and then it's funny, anytime I've met a Calvinist, they always can articulate why they're a Calvinist. And any time I've met an Arminianist, they're always just know they're not a Calvinist. Sort of, there seems to be this weird dichotomy where it's like, no, there's this Calvinist. They certainly got it wrong. Don't know why, but definitely got it wrong. And so, as much as like I was very lucky to have a church of pastors who were well educated and put a lot of energy and time into cultivating a church body that was still had some substance behind the expression, those sorts of discussions just never came up. So hearing Peterson, who tackle the Bible and bring God into a conversation where previously I think I'd only ever heard God brought into the conversation with the people he was conversing with that were like Josh McDowell or Rabbi Zacharias or others, where it's all apologetics based. it sort of, well, to be honest with you, it reframed theology to some extent to me. It reframed the idea that this wasn't just apologetics, that there was something deep to learn kind of for yourself, and that there was something you could take away deeply that was incredibly meaningful to you and to other people. And it didn't have to just be a defense of, biblical literalism or whatever other sort of idea. It was the idea of bringing metaphor in, and which I suppose you then later learn, like other traditions do that and use it. But it's not something I was surrounded with, I would say growing up. So watching Peterson go through that, and then at the same time, you listen to enough Peterson, he starts to rub off. The only reason I have an office with guitars hanging on the wall and wood paneling is because I continually heard clean up your room and then, also make it beautiful. So it becomes sort of a project. Like I can see these little Petersonian, quirks start working their way into your life. Mm-hmm. So it started having a profound impact on me in that way. And then also at the same time, I was kind of experiencing him using God in ways that I didn't seek out either, to be fair. Like I think from about 18 to I'm 29 now, I spent the last 9 years almost narrowly focused on career, and every piece of information I consumed was about business and kind of learning and growing that. So I sort of left the study side of the Bible by the wayside. I mean, when you're involved in church as heavily as I am, and you're running small groups and all that, you're involved in programs and you're going through the video series and you're reading the books, but it was all, again, purpose. There was a purpose behind everything. There was never any sort of free inquiry. And it was being exposed to Peterson that sort of reopened that. That's really just something that might even be interesting, if I'm honest. Mm-hmm. It's interesting dealing with or talking with or even seeing intellectuals.
Excuse me.
No problem. Bless you.
Thank you. That is a lousy cold, but keep going. I'm listening. I got a long cord, so if I disappear, I'm still listening.
Perfect. Especially like when you grow up in the tradition, a Pentecostal tradition, or something that has a little bit more, I would say, emphasis on the here and now, a little bit more emphasis on the practical, a little more emphasis on evangelism. Mm-hmm. Most of the time you come up against people who are, studying deeply or want to get into an argument about infant baptism versus, not. You sort of have this view of them, which is like, I think you're missing the point. Like, this is great. We can debate it, whether, you should baptize your infant or not, but why? What is the purpose we serve? Is it to build up our own ego? Is there really anything of value? And I suppose we'd always land on the side of, sure, we can talk about it, but that's for the ivory tower. We're here to do God's work practically day to day. Right. So and that was always, I think, the lens with which any sort of free inquiry or study was viewed, through people I grew up with or the tradition I grew up with. Even the people we would listen to as like, we're really stretching ourselves. It'd always be someone who was relatively practical. You're listening to like an Andy Stanley or someone else where it's very practical Bible basic sort of teaching. And that's not a knock on them. It just is what it is. So I spent time listening to Peterson. I've opened my mind up to treating theology with more free inquiry, and I think that's when you enter the scene. And almost at a very perfect moment where I was starting to sense that I'd been listening to too much. You can only, when you look back over all his material and go, I've listened to all of this. This is maybe too much. I might be listening to too much of this. I think that's when I saw it was either your first or second video talking about it, and it became a very good conversation partner, because it was almost a way I could enjoy the Peterson that I love, but then when I would hear things go, that's not right, there was always your voice to sort of bring it back and go, yeah, okay, you didn't get this right, but, and then you could kind of jump past the bigger picture, which to me was the right approach. There's a lot of people with different opinions on Peterson, especially educated people. They have varying opinions on him. And what I found is that most tended to miss the mark. I think they wanted to treat Peterson as a theologian and then criticize him from a theology perspective, or, man, you don't understand your Bible. But I don't think that was ever Peterson's role. I don't think he would have ever even claimed that for himself. It's almost like attacking someone like quotes some science every once in a while. You go, well, you're not a scientist, and you come after it. Okay, well, of course he's not a theologian. And they sort of missed the point of what he was doing.
Right.
It was almost like the criticisms always reeked of too much jealousy. I remember I read, I think it's Greg Boyd. I always get his name wrong. He wrote a bunch of articles.
Yeah. I read but some of his articles on Peterson.
Yeah, and most of the time I read through, and it's like, I think you're missing the point. I think you're criticizing him from the wrong perspective, and there's a little bit of, I would have done this better if I was in his position, leaking into it. So
there's a lot of Peterson envy around. There's a lot of academics and pastors who look at Peterson and say, why wasn't I on the status rocket? Why hasn't my book sold 2.5 million copies? Why haven't I visited 115 cities in 2018 and had everybody dripping on my last word? Yeah, there's a lot of envy around.
Yeah. There's if you only understood Feuerbach like I did. So that's too close, right? Maybe a little too close. Sorry. No, so I found that it's very easy to criticize Peterson on a lot of things, and but it's also very easy to take a lot of good away from it. And to me, I tended to look at him as, if there was, a chasm between faith in the Christian belief and Sam Harris, I don't know, let's put them on opposite ends. It was almost like there'd been a flood that filled the gap, and we'd seen a migration away of Christians, and he almost laid a bridge that was like permission for people to come back. And I think I always look at people who follow Peterson as like they're standing in the middle of the bridge, and so they're no longer on Mount Harris. They're somewhere in between, and so what Peterson does is it gives the platform for other people to join and call on either side. So I always found that as soon as people tried to go outside of that, you're a little bit missing the point, because he never goes past that in his talks. He's not willing to commit one way or the other. And so if he's not willing to commit, then you have to sort of play him with, you have to take him with the plane I suppose he's playing at. The game he's playing. Is that what that what you'd say?
No, that's right. And there's still plenty of question. Which game exactly is he playing, or rather, which game is at the top of the hierarchy of the games he's playing? That's not entirely clear, but no, you're right.
It's also not clear if he knows.
I agree with you 100% on that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. He strikes me as someone early on, when somebody contacted me who knows him personally and fairly well. And I asked him, I said, do you think he has a plan? This guy said, nope. He's and most of the time when he, like at the beginning of the Hangstyle video, he's kind of rolling out the beginning of 2018. He's taking it as it goes. And so he's riding the wave. That's what he's doing.
Well, even things like the lecture series, the biblical lecture series, which he's talked about fondly and sort of helped propel him.
Yep.
They just keep getting pushed because things come up, and I think he's a yes man to some extent too.
Yeah.
And sure.
Yeah.
So I wonder too if there's also an understanding of how rare of an opportunity this is, where you had a book you've been working on for 4 years, he said before, and at the right moment you're caught up in scandal.
Here I have this book ready-made for popular consumption. Let's publish it.
Yeah.
Too bad he didn't publish it with an American publisher, but the Canadian, so that the New York Times could snub him. No, You're exactly right. I mean, you look at how this thing went over, and it's like, this doesn't happen a lot. This is a big deal. And I know a lot of people, I say that to people are like, yeah, is it a big deal? I think, nah, this is a big deal.
Yeah, timing is interesting, right? it's a bad idea to sell umbrellas till it rains, because it's the only, when else are you gonna? Nobody buys. It's sort of like a plunger. No one buys a plunger preemptively.
That's right. That's right.
Or no one calls a plumber preemptively.
That's right. But it was almost like, here's Peterson in 1849 in the foothills just east of Sacramento, and he's got a whole train car load of shovels. You know, it's like there he was right there, and yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah. No, you know what? I think it's really good. It's an amazing thing. It's not, you don't want to start saying words like divine or ordained, but it is amazing.
Why not say those words? You know, okay, I'm showing my Calvinism, but God does what he wants, and in surprising ways. And this is part of the story of the Bible. I mean, the amazing thing about the Old Testament is that the Jewish prophets convinced the people that God brought Babylon against them, and they still stuck with him.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty incredible. So God, you know, now exactly what God's going to do with this, who knows? I don't know. But Peterson would say God only knows. But no, I think this is a big deal, and I wouldn't be doing videos on it for a year if I didn't think it was a big deal. It's been a big deal for me.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking with my pastor, and he brought up the book of Amos, and he said, you know, when was the last time you were reading Amos? But he mentions there's this line, and I won't try and quote the verse because I'll get it wrong. But essentially, it was, I helped the Babylonians or whoever escape from their captors, and it was basically saying all your enemies. I was behind the movements of their geopolitical wars and helped shape the world, as it were.
That's right. That's
so
right.
It's so interesting. I think I brought it up to the point of, we were talking about business dealings and do you pray before a business dealing? And I sort of half joking said, I don't think God cares. Why would he? I'm going up to strike a deal with some other person in the church. Do you think God favors one? I mean, obviously there's something that he values in the interchange and relationship between the two, but it's sort of like praying over sporting events to some extent. It's like, is God a Dodgers fan, or is he?
Boy, but when I was 11, I sure prayed hard for those Yankees, you know.
Well, I'm outside of Toronto, so we're in a bit of a drought. Haven't heard the prayers yet.
Well, I'm a Calvinist. He also ordains others to lose, like the Sacramento Kings in basketball.
Yeah. You know, my first experience with CRC in general was I took a job at a marketing agency, unbeknownst to me that everyone who worked there was CRC. And one of the, they had their interview and mentioned, are you a believer? Because we're going to talk about faith in the workplace, and we just want to make sure that's something you'd be comfortable with. If you're not, it's totally fine, but there's going to be discussion. And I said, oh, sure. Of course, again, all my interactions had either been with the Bloody Baptists or, fellows within the denomination. And actually, it was one of the best experiences I had interdenominationally. Mm-hmm. Sure. Because I was sort of confronted by people whose worldview was so wildly different on a lot of subjects that I just assumed that nobody believed anymore. And again, poorly and arrogantly, sorry to the YouTube comments. It's just, I was into business. But it was a fantastic experience because, I was able to sort of glean these things from other denominations that you can kind of see where your own house is lacking when you're exposed to more options, as it were.
Yeah.
So when I first learned your CRC, it was funny. I had this almost like warm connection. Like, oh, The wonderful CRC gentleman. Yes,
I know who those people are.
Yeah, smoked too much probably, but good.
Well, the Dutch, the CRC in Canada immigrated after the Second World War. That was a totally different wave that, let's say, my great-grandparents came in the 1890s. And so immigrants always bring with them the culture they leave, and it kind of sets them in a certain way. They preserve that culture. So it's in the CRC, it's 2/5 of the CRC is Canadian and 3/5 is on the southern side of the border. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. It was interesting to me because it was this whole other culture too, like where, especially Canadian CRC, everyone owned their business and also had 12 kids, which was so foreign to me because I grew up where everyone's like, oh, you had 2 kids. It's a pretty big family. You might want to take her easy.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a beautiful experience in that way, and the value on family, and also actually interesting, the value on Bible teaching. Again, they all knew they were Calvinist.
Yeah.
They all read the right blogs and all had sort of similar viewpoints, which was great. It was a good experience to sort of be pulled out of your world a little bit, and then have something common where we're all in marketing, we're all working together. So there's that common elements and that common faith, but able to discuss between our denominational heresies.
I totally believe it. That's the CRC. It's a little different from what I grew up kind of half in it because I went to day school, and because CRC people are big about their day schools, so they're private schools. But then of course my father's church was black, so I lived in 2 worlds growing up. And of course, when you grow up with something, you don't realize that. Doesn't everyone live in 2 worlds growing up? No, not everybody does. I did, but it was normal for me. So that's where I get my weird mixture of all the weird mixtures I am.
Yeah, it's funny, especially watching some of the people interact in comments or even talk about different topics being in Canada, because even though I grew up in a relatively like middle-classy, waspy town, all of my friends growing up were of various backgrounds, and it's like my best friend was Somalian, and my good friends were all, I ride to school with the Sikh children, and it is a totally different experience. So sometimes when I see even transplants from the States and how even the culture works, it's so interesting because the problems they have are so different when they're integrating other cultures, where I think in Canada, there's almost there's this lack of identity. So you're not trying to preserve an identity because there's been no identity to preserve.
Yeah.
You're trying to just figure out who you are and where you belong. And every church is trying to do that to some extent. Every city is going to be like a Pentecostal church 40 minutes away from me is going to be very, very different than in my town. Because we're not linked by those denominational or even demographic consistencies. Everything's very different.
I've never been to Toronto. I've been to Burlington because the CRC has offices there, and I had to go there for a meeting.
That's where I live.
Oh, well, there you go. But one of the things that's often struck me are some of the similarities between California and places like Toronto that are they're hyper diverse, and that dynamic where California has often been a place where people in the eastern part of the United States go to get away from their past, and California has higher than the West Coast obviously has higher percentages of Asian immigrants, because obviously you're on the Pacific, so you've got Japanese communities, Chinese communities, Vietnamese communities, Hmong communities, Korean communities, and all of that. And you've got African American communities that came over during the Great Migration. You've got white folks who came over. You've got more indigenous populations. You've got the whole Mormon thing going. So, and then you continue to have waves of new immigrants. California continues to be a net loser to other American states in terms of migration. Americans move out of California to other places in the country, but because there's so much immigration, foreign immigration into California, up from Mexico, over from Asia, from all over the world, it continues to grow. So it's similar to that. And, I don't know a lot about Toronto, but some of the, one of the things that struck me in watching these dynamics is, Peterson, it's so funny when people just kind of try to peg Peterson as some right winger, because I think he's a Canadian moderate that puts him left of center on the American spectrum in many ways. And he's very used to cultural diversity and diversity of many kinds, because that's the context that he's been living in and working in for a very long time. And so when people misread him as some kind of isolationist, right-wing ideologue, it's like, you're not listening to the guy. You're not really paying attention to who he is and where he fits.
It's an ignorant statement. It really is, because one, you just have to look at his lecture videos, and his classes are incredibly diverse because he teaches at University of Toronto.
Yeah.
You can't find a more diverse university except maybe downtown New York. And even then, probably not, just based on the type of university that University of Toronto is.
Yeah.
You can look at his classes, you can look at enrollment in those schools, you can look at the people he would have interacted with.
Yeah.
And before that, he spent time in Montreal. It's a really ignorant statement.
Yeah.
He's never spent time in Toronto or living. You don't survive in Toronto as a racist.
Yeah.
You'll move out.
Yeah. Now, what do you think about Peterson in terms of your church? Are you like the only person in your church that you know of that looks at Peterson, or I don't know the demographics of your church?
We're a relatively large church for Canada, which isn't saying much because our population is small. But I think we average somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 a week.
That's a big church.
Yeah, I mean, we had a pastor join us about 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. I think we were a church of 290, 315.
Okay.
So he's one of those, like, I think if you dropped him in the middle of the forest with an axe, he's Peterson's classic, which is chop down trees all day. He's just sort of, it's on every board for all the denominations, sits on the school board, finished his master's, like, while doing and growing a church, and does leadership training. He's just one of those people. So I think by nature of him coming, he attracted a whole bunch of go-getters. Mm-hmm. So our church is largely, I would say, middle people with the young kids. I think we have 300 kids in the kids programs. So it's a lot of families. I think we're 70 or 80 nations represented. So it's pretty multicultural.
Wow.
Church. And as far as, we're not a university town in Burlington, so we lose kids at about 18 to 25. So they don't typically come back at 25 because Burlington's a little more expensive. So we see them move back mid-30s when they've had their first kid and they're looking to kind of suburbanite themselves. They'll move back into Burlington, and then we see them join. So typically our church will range from like 35 to probably 55, somewhere in that range. We used to be a largely senior church with a lot of youth, but demographics sort of changed as we've grown. So as far as young adults, there's not many to begin with. But as far as those of us that are there, all the men consume some degree of Peterson content.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I run a young, we call it like a young married small group. And I would say every guy that attends consumes into some degree. So there'll be some that consume everything he's put out, and some that, listen the odd every once in a while. But everyone's consumed or consumes a little bit of it.
So is Peterson a guilty pleasure, or do you actually have conversations about him on church grounds?
Definitely have conversations on church grounds, but that also might be because what does being on church grounds mean to a Pentecostal?
Right. Yeah, that's true. But is there any kind of programming at the church that in any way engages Peterson's work directly?
No, no. It is. I would say the staff are too busy because I've talked to my pastor about it, and his, I believe him. He's aware of it and aware of the phenomenon, and is aware of like as much as I think he can give himself the time to take on. But I'm sure he's like most and sees a 4-hour video and goes, "Oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have other studying I need to do right now."
yeah, yeah.
But has never said anything negative except that he's seen the positive bits of it. And the other pastors, when I've spoken about it, they're all aware. But I've never really engaged in a long conversation with any of them
Hmm.
about it. The young men, I think it sort of happens naturally, the conversations regarding Peterson and talking about the ideas and throwing them back and forth. So I don't know that there's ever really been this need, or we haven't perceived a need to have a group, I suppose, because it happens so naturally. The conversations, and people will see each other on a Sunday. Oh, did you see that one video? Or something will come up and it'll come up in discussion. But I think Peterson is less important to some of them, where they're trying to balance that with whatever other content they're consuming. So I don't know. The truth is, I've never tried to start one or invested in starting
Yeah,
one, energy into what it would take to start something like that.
yeah.
So I don't know.
So who is Peterson for these men? I mean, is he? So you got Joe Rogan, you got Peterson, you got Jocko, you got I mean, where does he kind of? So they're watching his videos. Is he entertainment? Is it? I mean, what's happening in there? I'm really curious.
Most of them wouldn't consume Yako, or they wouldn't consume too much Joe Rogan, maybe a little bit.
Okay.
I don't think most of them would consume Dave Rubin, or Ben Shapiro. I think would be consumed by a bunch of them, mostly because, but I think Ben Shapiro's entertainment. I don't know that they're watching him to.
Well, you're not voting in the United States, so
no. I would guess that in some cases, what Peterson is to me is similar to what he is to the others. It's almost like there's an element that's missing from church. I really can appreciate when you say, if someone listens to your videos and shows up to a church service on a Sunday morning, it's going to be very difficult for them to make that transition.
Yep.
There is a lot built into church and what Sunday form factors are, and people will be a little bit shocked at how much we sing, and that takes a long time to get used to, because it's a lot of singing. We were talking about this a little while. It's a lot of singing. Like, oftentimes you're in a half hour of singing songs that you're not going to know, and
that's right.
A very condensed message that's polished, because you have to split the difference between, those in your church they have their PhD, and those who, didn't graduate high school, even though they tried. Like, you're really splitting the difference between those groups. And so there's a form factor to it. And I think no matter how good you try to make that form factor, there are limitations. There are not limitations, maybe is the best way to describe it. And so I think Peterson it's a bit of escapism, because there's more to Peterson than just the theology or the discussions of God. There's the self-responsibility, which in a lot of denominations, or people in similar, more charismatic denominations, they tend to feel more feminine in their expression. There's a little more emphasis on experience. There's a little more emphasis on feeling and sensing, and some of that's good, and some of it's not. So I do think there's an element of it that part's missing for them. So to hear someone say, listen, guys, you kind of just have to get your shit together and get moving here, that's meaningful. And then the way he approaches integrating God into conversations, I think that for a lot of them it goes beyond what you're going to hear at your typical apologist's talk. And I think it's intriguing and interesting. And the ideas are something you can take and bat around and beat up a little bit. And depending on your level of understanding, you can engage with them more, and they're sort of never ending in how deep you can go into the subjects. And then what's great about them is the encouragement to dive into other texts. So sort of around the same time I started engaging with Peterson, I started Arthur F. Holmes' philosophy course. He'd recorded it back. I got the recommendation for you. Is it Carey Price? Is that his name? I'm getting it. I'm sure.
Philip Carey.
Philip Carey. Or is Carey Price? I think that's a golfer. Sorry. So I started going through his course as well, and then we dive into, you go back and you start reading Plato and Aristotle and working. Yeah. You get bored, and so you try and read a little Kierkegaard, and you go back to these original texts, and so it sort of encouraged you to go into text that probably at some point were either forced to read or you purposely avoided. So I think there's an element of it too where it tends to be a catalyst, because he starts making references to Notes from the Underground. And then you go read Notes from the Underground and you go, oh, like I have a whole other context on what Peterson's saying. References this line from this book. And I also can see how much it clearly influenced him, because you see so much of it coming out in the way he speaks. And I'm sure that's similar with all his resources or all his influences. The more you read them, the more you see them come out. So I think there's a couple of elements. One is that there's a little bit of the missing masculine push. I want to be careful how I say that, though, because it's a loaded statement to some extent. If you say it's a missing masculine push, because then you're making statements on, one, the church, two, the relationship with their fathers, and three, their own personal masculinity. So I want to be careful. It's not that it's that. It's just that it's a more raw conversation that I think you see in behind the door conversations that you don't see from the onstage conversations. Peterson has this very Albertan style of conversation. And so I'm born in Alberta, family all live in Alberta, very familiar with Roughnecks. I think actually people don't appreciate how much that affects Peterson.
Oh, that's right.
The reason why Peterson likes to talk to Rogan and Yako and even Camille Pageley, there's this toughness that he's attracted to because he grew up around it. And it's really hard to, even people who complain about not getting to have conversations with him, they also have to factor that in. The people he likes to talk to he has a type.
That's right.
There's a type of person he likes to talk to.
That's right.
And spending some time in Alberta would help people kind of understand that a little more.
Yeah. My brother-in-law is from Manitoba. And when I started watching Peterson, so I know my brother-in-law, obviously, and his brother, I know a brother of his, fairly well too. And I saw it immediately. He's from the West. And so that, I think that's very true. That's really interesting. There's been a lot of, I was trying to think of, so the Promise Keepers, I don't know to what degree Promise Keepers hit Canada the way it hit the U.S., especially in Pentecostal circles. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Let me pull up
I think I know what you're talking about.
Eldridge, Wild at Heart, I think was his book. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe that wasn't it. No, I'm not looking at. But there was a John Eldridge. That's right. Wild at Heart. Richard. I mean, there's been a lot of masculinity questions have been creeping around the edges of evangelicalism, including, Pentecostal communities are very deeply evangelical in many ways, many elements of the culture. And so these conversations have been lurking and stalking for at least a couple of decades, and they get manifest in the Roman Catholic context. Richard Rohr. So these things are out there, and a number of authors they've been really wrestling with trying to figure out what this means. And you know, women have the conversation about Christianity and masculinity is a deep one. Even though a lot of people on the surface say, well, you've got Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, at least two of them are male. You don't have Mary, and then you get the Jungian questions about masculinity and femininity and the Godhead. And so, but the arguments among many about the feminine, the feminine ethos of evangelical churches and the church in general, not so much the Orthodox, but Roman Catholic and Protestants. I mean, those are long, old conversations. And so, you know, what you say doesn't surprise me, because I don't know. We've kind of had man culture alongside of church culture in many ways. And the attempt to integrate, well, you'd have, you know, for example, we have women's Bible studies, and our women's Bible studies, they are strong, they grow, they go. The men don't have to do a thing, but they're, for years, I, you know, was trying to do some men's Bible studies and never got the traction. And now suddenly I've got all these men coming to church for meetups to talk about Jordan Peterson. And it's not a Bible study. We're not studying the Bible at all, but it's kind of like there's something to that. And I can't put it all out there, and I certainly can't resolve it, but there's something going on there. And it's interesting to me that your church, that a fair number of men, doesn't surprise me, fair number of men of a certain age are, you know, they know who Jordan Peterson is, and they're watching his videos, or at least some of them, and to one degree or another, they're in there, especially in a conservative Christian environment. Mainline, you know, it's going to be a different situation. But how, then the question is, okay, how is there integration? And it's been interesting that a lot of the movement we've seen in Peterson among men has been Sam Harris tribes, people kind of moving out of evangelicalism and then maybe coming now back in with him. So it's really interesting to me, and I don't have it figured out by any means how this stuff plays and what it means. So it's, I mean, what the stories that you've told me is just, I find it very interesting data. Mm-hmm. And it would be, again, I have all these ideas that if I could just spawn myself, I would go up to your church, and I would spend a few weeks interviewing young men and listening to them and trying to figure out, okay, well, what's going on with Peterson? Why are you attracted to him? And, you know, he's definitely masculine. He's definitely Canadian. This rough edge of Canadian culture. But yet.
But then he spent a lot of time in major cities.
That's true.
A lot of time around students.
That's true. That's very true. Well, and you can see those. Well, so he grows up. I mean, the irony for me is that my father, coming out of seminary, had two calls. One was to Paterson, New Jersey, which he took because his bride's family was 4 hours north in Massachusetts. The other was to Barhead, Alberta. I mean, this is way up there. And I could very well have grown up in, you know, that region not far from Peterson. I would have been a different person. So, but Peterson goes way the heck up north, very new town, very rough area, indigenous population, so on and so forth. But what are his parents' jobs? They're teachers. And if you're in a kind of a frontiersy area, it's the teachers are always kind of they're not far from it, because they're definitely involved in the culture in the town, because they're with the children of the workers, but they're the bookish sorts, and they're, they're a little bit apart. So it's, these tensions within his own story are also interesting. And while he's a bona fide academic, this desire to integrate, and I could look at my own story like that. So I've got my Dutch Calvinist Christian school upbringing, but I've got my impoverished Black community struggling side of me. And so in that way, I'm also always been an integrator. I'm always trying to take things that don't quite fit together and say, well, how do these both really occupy the same world? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to me, the story you tell about your church, and even a church that large in Canada is very interesting. Mm-hmm. Because, talking to CRC pastors I know from Canada, I mean, Canada religiously is a very different place than the United States.
There is no guilt on Sunday morning to go to church.
No. And to have a 1,500 member Pentecostal church in North America, there's tons of them. Yeah, there's probably only a handful of them in Canada. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's very interesting that in your particular subculture, that there's a lot of people, a lot of young men your age listening to Peterson. That's not a surprise. That's his demographic. But then is it integrated into, is it alongside? To me, those are very interesting questions.
So a few things as you're talking.
Yep.
One, in relation to his parents being teachers in a small town.
Yep.
What's super interesting about that to me is that teachers in a small town tend to have also a very different view of their students.
Yes.
So my wife's a teacher, and when she's taught up in schools in smaller towns or private schools in smaller towns, the relationship to the students and the interest in their education is much higher, because you're the only one in a lot of cases to teach them anything. It feels like you're the last line of educational defense before they go off into the world. And many of them won't go off into the world. They will go to the rigs.
Right.
So your sense of duty to your students is very different than a public school where you're just seeing so many kids move through in a big city, and it's very difficult. They become more of a number.
Yep.
There's a few that stand out, but you're not going to see a whole class from kindergarten to end of high school closely.
Right.
To throw another wrench in my church and the subculture, again, be it based on who my church attracts, it's not even that the young men at my church are watching Peterson out of the need to straighten their lives out. Many of them have their lives figured out.
Yes.
The other part where they're all career-oriented, married, buying their homes and bucking the culture in that trend, just because that tends to be who my church attracts, which is maybe part of the reason why it's growing. And I make jokes about the Pentecostalism because there's a lot of oddities. And again, 40 minutes outside of my house, I know people are dancing with flags and blowing shofars every Sunday. So it's very easy to make fun of my denomination. But
well, there's lots of layers to Pentecostalism. It's a huge world, and,
yes. And
I'm very aware of that.
I should say AGS because that's probably less offensive.
Yes.
But it's so much more fun to say Pentecostal. And watch people's eyes bug out, and then tell them the size of the church. So it's very interesting because Peterson doesn't seem to be helping them straighten their lives out. He tends to be helping them orient their thoughts to some degree. There's almost like an intellectual challenge to Peterson. I think a lot of the times when people are listening to him, and again, for all the people who may eventually watch this,
I'll send it to you. You can decide.
Yeah. There's this, I understand that N.T. Wright exists, and I understand that the truth is there are so many theologians, and when you grow up in a tradition where there is an emphasis on practical application of the Bible, and there is an element of, well, it's all great that you know your 5 points of Calvinism, but have any of your friends receive Jesus as their Lord and Savior as being, as a result of being friends with you? And,
That's right.
And there's that emphasis. And again, that's where you can get this interesting debates like, well, do numbers matter, or is it go make disciples, not numbers? And then as a marketer, I can argue, well, it's really easy. We can actually measure that because you can measure anything you care about. And yes, it's maybe a bit of a funnel, and some people come in the top and they fall out the sides, but your net numbers. I mean, there's lots of stuff you can do and have those debates back and forth, which I think are useful. But I think what was missing was some of the intellectual challenges. Everything was very practical. How do you live as a man? How do you, as a teenager, exist in high school but outside of high school and resist the temptations? Everything was very practical life application. And so I think Peterson presented an intellectual challenge in a packaging that was interesting. He happens to be charismatic. He happens to be from Northern Alberta and have some of those manly roughneck charms that come along with him. He happens to be willing to drop the gloves and fight, but also be very sensitive. There's a lot to him that makes him interesting. And so he's a good conduit for, at least I found in my tradition, for people to reorient their thinking about what they're consuming for mental food.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this element where he's helping guide them towards, N.T. Wright is someone that, since listening to Peterson 2 years ago, has become interesting to me. Right? It's a philosophy, something that was never interesting. Again, over the last couple of years, has become very interesting. And you realize then, once you get interested, then you go read the original text, then you realize, oh my gosh, I've heard people misuse this text many times. And it becomes this path you sort of start to embark on. But I've noticed that the people who consume Peterson in my church, they're all at different parts in that journey. Some it's just, hey, what kind of podcasts can I listen to? That would be interesting. And others, it's they're already debating with him on the topic. So, Peterson missed this part completely, and really what he should have been talking about is this. And so, more than anything, I think that's where he's been helpful to. And actually, funny, you called my tradition conservative, which is weird because growing up, we never thought of ourselves as conservative. We always thought we were the crazy liberals compared to the conservative Baptists down the road. And did you know that they're not allowed to have an electric guitar on Sunday? Right. And then you run into the CRC and find out that hymns are too new. So
singing psalms, baby. What are you doing? Right. Making up your own songs? I don't like that.
It's weird. It's like there's a Bible verse about it or something. I don't know.
Oh boy.
Actually, I had this thought the other day, and I'll say it, and then there was one thing I wanted to hop back into that you said earlier that was really interesting. But the modern Pentecostals, or at least evangelicals that are adopting sort of the new expressions with music and lights and all this stuff, it's very Catholic. It's very Catholic, because Catholicism is interesting to me in their expression. I suppose I'm sure there's a reason, because there's always a reason if it's Catholicism, but I never quite understood why Gothic architecture was where they decided holiness lived, and why they decided that robes from Victorian ages that's the appropriate wear. Because first off, it's not accurate to the timeline of when Jesus walked the earth, and two, the world has moved on in its expression of art. And to me, you would think that a Frank Lloyd Wright building would be a more beautiful expression now of a church versus a Gothic. And you could argue you might prefer one to the other, but you would think that the expression would continue to evolve as time went on, because if we're paying homage through art, why choose a Gothic era many hundreds of years after? So it's just something to think about.
You can find very modern Roman Catholic churches.
You can. Sure, you can. But even the expression, the dress, it's always interesting. If the idea is that we're presenting our best, then wouldn't the best in today's world be different than the best in,
That's not the only idea. I'll say it that way. But
fair enough.
But not to defend, but your observations are right, because what you're expressing are these two, these different sides of these different approaches to God. And I mean, evangelicalism, it's its own thing. It's got its own values. It's shaped the way it is for a reason. It's just true. And certain things are valued in, because there is a theological, there's a theological economy under that, and or a theological, let's say, geology under that, and it's getting expressed in the landscape by the forces underneath. And so, yeah, it all has history. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it's just, that's what's so interesting about it, right? Because there's criticisms of, it's almost like you find denominations stuck in different time periods. And I'm sure in 20 years, we'll be stuck in our own expression that people will look back and be like, man, why would they still be expressing it this way? Times have moved and changed. So I find there's this, well, so rather than finishing that thought, I'll jump to what I heard you say earlier, and what I thought was interesting, which is you were talking about men and the different ways that masculinity has been displayed through different denominations. And one thing that struck me as listening to Peterson and taking his personality tests and then watching other people take personality tests is it's very interesting to me to see what types of personalities congregate to different styles of expression. Now, it's not perfect to say that people will congregate around their personality type, because people are born into it, and that's where you're going to have the heretics within your own church and those who love, hate your expression, the expression of worship. But there is something to be said about the Sam Harris crowd would be very unhappy in most of the Pentecostal churches.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And on the alternative side of that, the artistic crowd would be miserable in a lot of the, I don't know, church environments that the Sam Harris crowd might like, right? So let me use another example. I have a friend who we've been conversing, and he was at one point a staunch, took every chance he got to fight with me about whether there was a God or not. And it was good. I found that over time we just kept a relationship and kept talking. And then one day he sort of admitted to me, hey, I've sort of been thinking that maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing if, life didn't just end and it was all meaningless. And so, so since then, obviously it's been interesting to have conversations with him, and he has been following the Petersonian path as well.
Yeah.
But for him, based off his personality, which, like, all good friends, they're totally opposite to mine, he loves the structure and many of the things that to me would feel rigid or stale of some of the more traditional denominations. It appeals to him. And he likes the idea that, there's a long history of tradition and it's not new. And when we did his personality test, I think on openness, it was like close to 0, in the 99th percentile. So the idea that things aren't changing is death. So there is something interesting about how I'd be curious to know, or to see some research done into how much of our denominational differences are really personality driven more than anything else, and we're justifying our beliefs after the fact with the verses, but we're essentially aligning ourselves with a tradition that we prefer, or an expression of worship that we prefer, based off of a certain type of personality. Now, I understand it's not perfect, because there are true theological differences, and there are things that you're born into, and there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
But I would be interested to know how much you think personality plays into that, because for me, I don't think from a personality standpoint, would have stayed in the denomination I was if I wasn't born into it. I just realized there's too much of me that, as much as I might be high in openness, there's other things I don't like.
Yeah.
But I've spent so much time in it that you grow to love what you have, and you grow to love your church, and you grow to love the people. And then you can also evaluate, if I can be involved somewhere and bring a differing opinion, or or add value, it's probably to a place where I have some disagreements.
Yeah.
And I can be of greater service here as a servant than to go to somewhere else, which maybe perfectly aligns with my personality or how I like to experience things,
Yeah.
Or even who I align with perfectly on theology, but then miss the opportunities to serve and bring a differing view. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on how much our personalities impact, or as Peterson said, here's an idea for you. Tell me what you think.
There's no question that different denominations have cultures that align with certain personality elements more than others and exhibit it. A question would be, obviously, well, it's just so complicated because people get born into families, and then, for example, my older sister. So I had an older sister. I have an older sister, and my younger sister died. But temperamentally, my older sister and my younger sister are in many ways far apart. My older sister is an artist. She's a musician. She's expressive. She's super high in openness. She's terribly creative. My younger sister is also in many ways very open and creative, and she did English. So it was much more in literature that she expressed herself, where my older sister was in music and art and some of these things. My younger sister loved routine. And so she camped in the same campground every summer, tried to camp on the same site every summer. She went to the same church every week, same service every week, sat in the same seat every week. I mean, that was my younger sister. My older sister is totally different. And so my older sister has been in and out of Pentecostal churches and ministries and situations, and because that in many ways fit to a degree something of her temperament. But here's a funny thing about Pentecostalism too, because these questions of order and chaos, you might look at my older sister and say, oh, there's so much chaos in her. She likes spontaneity. She likes all of this. It's also interesting that in many Pentecostal traditions, you get some fairly rigid ideas of authority, and being submissive to authority has a very high value in certain areas of Pentecostal tradition. And so what we tend to find is that in the church traditions, the order and chaos things tend to continue to balance each other out. And whereas someone comes into a Pentecostal church and thinks, well, this is just crazy. This person is speaking in tongues over here, and they're trying to interpret over there, and the music is completely modern here, and you got the lights and the smoke machine, and you got the music leader in skinny jeans, and the pastor is, begging the people to, but within all of that seeming expressiveness, there's also real structure and traditions and repetition. And so, and what you tend to find is that for a tradition to actually flourish, there's going to need to be those balances within it too. And so you can go to one of the most creative Pentecostal churches and find right next to all of this expressiveness, very set, repetitive, well, this is the way we do things. These are the things that hold us firm. All of these things are variable. So, the Bible is our foundation for everything, but we can change the liturgy and the music and everything depending on what's hot and relevant, because and what we're trying to do is land people on the Bible. Whereas an Orthodox church, Jonathan Pajot says, the reason I go to an Orthodox church is it doesn't matter if the pastor is a crazy git. They're going to be up there doing the liturgy, and there's going to be maybe a 10 or 15 minute homily. And so we all come for the liturgy, and okay, now for the homily. So the idiot has to share with us his incredible banality, but it doesn't matter because, and so, but then on the walls, then you've got, you're going to do this, you're going to have Jesus in the dome, and you're going to have the disciples on the walls, and then some new places are going to try to add innovation. And once they do innovation, others are going to turn away from that. So you have these dynamics that get expressed through all of these different areas. And generally speaking, if a tradition is going to flourish, they will find balance within the tradition, even though it would be easy to say, my older sister fits better in a Pentecostal church, because in many ways she does. And my younger sister, she doesn't want to deal with that. Someone standing up and, having a word of knowledge or or a prophecy, or, my younger sister would be like, why don't you do that at home? I'm not saying anything about it, but why don't you do that at home? This is my church time, and I have my expectations, and I expect it to go according to script. So and the thing is, I'm right in the middle of both of them, and it was like, I don't know how in the distribution things were, but I got some of my older sister, and I got some of my younger sister, and I'm the only boy, so. And you see that with denominations. So you'll go, if I look around here, let's pluck, where is Gordon Fee? Gordon Fee, a terrific New Testament Pentecostal scholar. His commentary on 1 Corinthians, wonderful stuff, printed in the New International Commentary of the New Testament by Erdman's, Grand Rapids, Michigan, founded by Dutch Reformed people. So, this is, and so then when you get to someone like Richard Foster, Springs of Living Water, I used to have that down here. So Richard Foster then says, coming from the Quaker tradition, look at these traditions. You've got the Reformed, and you've got the Pentecostal, and you've got the Roman Catholic, and you've got the Orthodox, and God uses these traditions to express himself in a whole variety of ways that, just like one kind of beetle isn't enough, one kind of denomination isn't enough, because God is just that big and just that rich and just that glorious that he's borne witness to in the contemporary riffs of a dynamic 2-hour worship set in a Pentecostal church, and the quiet predictability of an Orthodox liturgy, and the frozen chosen Reformed folks who are, holding on doggedly to their versification of the Psalms. So Eugene Peterson says, not Jordan, Eugene Peterson, God plays in 10,000 places. So there's my take.
Yeah. It's interesting, like even the differences between what you call order and chaos in the church and the different denominations, because you're right. In a lot of the more charismatic expressions, yep, the leadership holds a much stronger place in the minds of the attendees, whereas in more traditional maybe expression in church, you'll find that people are like, it's just the pastor. I can debate with him all day.
Well, in Reformed, especially in some Reformed churches where the pastor is not that high up, he's subject to the council. But you go to an Orthodox tradition, and I just spoke with an Orthodox father this morning, and afterwards I thought I should have called him father, because I was, to an Orthodox listener, I was probably way too dismissive. But in a black church, the pastor can be really high and lifted up, as in a Pentecostal church. If it's a really anointed pastor,
yeah,
it's amazing how these things get expressed.
Yeah, that's why the personality aspect is so interesting to me, because again, like you said, everyone fits on the spectrum differently, and the idea that personalities aren't so perfect that it's like, oh, you're this type of person, you'll like this, because there's experience, and then there's also learning, and there's all these different things that go into it. But one of the things I would love to see is a little more unity in churches. So I'm always so curious, like what are the elements that we can find and agree on? I think it was Bishop Barron said this recent, or I don't know, I can't remember when, but I think he was talking with, might have been Ben Shapiro. But he was talking about the different denominations and how it's like, listen, I love my Protestant brothers, but there's 30,000 denominations and we have one church. And it struck me as interesting, because there is as much as I would come from a tradition and likely in the end would go, well, no, I think we're good with our different denominations to some extent. There's something valuable there, right? That there is this hierarchy and this tradition where we're all moving together towards the same goal, and there's some unity within the body, and there's place for disagreement, but there is kind of a final head to say, this is what we do now.
Yeah. Then again, the Roman Catholic Church has 2 popes right now. One retired, but it's really hard. And people talk about unity and say, okay, well, what does unity look like? Is it institutional? Because what's interesting about evangelicalism is they too are striving after unity, but they do so in a different way. So they'd say, well, you need to go, someone moves into a town, you need to go to a Bible-believing church. Well, there's a structure of unity. And that actually comes from the frontier. So it's a complicated business to talk about, to figure out what unity is. Not to take anything away from the Roman Catholics. And Bishop Barron's point about Protestantism is dead on right. But it's Jesus wants us to be one. Okay, define one. Is it okay?
Makes room for that there's going to be different cultures.
Yeah.
And that there's going to be different expressions. So I think you can't get away from that. Maybe we do a weekly community dinner where we essentially invite in people from the community and do a weekly dinner. And one of the things that we were purposeful was to partner with other churches of different denominations within to help fund and put it together. So to me, it's like you can find the small examples like that, and how do you scale that to the place where you can worship in the place that makes sense for you, but that maybe we don't kill each other in the streets.
That'd be a good thing. I think we'd agree on that. Let's not kill each other over our confessional differences.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something we had to figure out, and it took a long time. And so, let's hope the world of Islam can maybe learn something from that and not kill each other over some of their differences. But no, these are all good, hard questions. and that sometimes, anyway, go on forever on this. Any last things? We should probably land the plane at some point.
Yeah. Well, one, I wanted to make sure I properly thanked you for your contribution. And thank you also for making a podcast, because that makes commute listening so much easier.
Oh yeah, it does. it does. Because I appreciate it, because I noticed that Rogan and Ruben both had. I thought, yeah, that's just easy on folks.
Yeah, it's being able to passively listen is nice, right? You're not consumed by a screen. Although obviously you missed something with the screen, but yeah, it allows for a lot more. I don't know.
Well, you're very welcome, because again, I feel gratified and honored that people like you and people like you will give me your time. Time for us is an incredibly precious thing. And so I frankly am humbled by this whole affair. Many days I don't quite know what to think about it, but this seems to be, and I do think that Peterson's explosion is an act of God, and maybe my little pop is an act of God too, because I've been gratified by this and blessed by conversations talking to you and to many others, and I have learned a tremendous amount in this process, and in so many ways I'm indebted to so many people for everything that I've learned, and I deeply appreciate it.
Well, and it provides a lot of extra context that those who'd spend so much time consuming Peterson's content would miss. And while there are other people jumping into the game, like we kind of discussed at the beginning of the conversation, it's hard to know whether they're adversaries or not. So
yeah,
it's a valuable piece to have, and it's helped me immensely, because it took me from having sort of singular focus on the things I would do, which is very, maybe not transactional, but to some extent transactional, where I have a goal, I'm going to consume the content required to get me this goal.
Yeah.
I have a Bible study we're leading, I'm going to consume the content necessary for this Bible study. Whatever the goal was. And so being able to find an enjoyment in pulling back and looking at the bigger picture, and taking the reading suggestions and the course suggestions and listening through the content now as an adult, or hopefully an adult, and finding the joy, and even learning, the Platonic influence on Christianity, and then reading those sources and going, oh my gosh, it's, those are the things my tradition didn't encourage. Or
that may be the biggest gift Peterson has given to a lot of people, because not only has he been a gateway drug into Christianity, he has been a gateway into a lot of learning for a lot of people. And even though he's, on one hand, he's a clinical psychologist very much wanting to help individuals sort their own lives out, he's also a teacher. And what he's really done is open a much bigger educational world for many, many people. And I've seen that as I've been, I've kind of been working the Peterson crowd. That's essentially what I've done. And that's one of the big takeaways from what he's really, the gift that he's really given.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, we are over time, so
I'm
sorry.
Thank you, Thomas. No, that's absolutely fine. It's the end of the day, so we got a few extra minutes, get a little more flexibility. So in the middle of the day, I've got people stacked up, and so I don't want to rob time from the other, but I appreciate it. So thanks for reaching out and giving me another hour of your time. And what I'll do is I will render this right away, and I will send it to you, and you can decide what you'd like to do with it. Let me know.
And if you ever want to have more Torontonian men interviewed, I'm happy to film them and send them.
Oh, that would be fun. That you never know what'll happen, but if I get up to Toronto, I just might take you up on that. Say, round a bunch of those folks up. I want to pick their brains. I want to listen to them. So
perfect.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.